Now, I got into college a year earlier than most of my peers in the same age because I skipped a grade in high school. So in my first year of uni, people in my class were usually all 1 or 2 years older than me. I know that all of this sounds a bit overboard to people in the West where like 1 or 2 years of age difference is not really a big deal, but in Asian countries such as Japan and South Korea, it is kind of a big deal. For instance, in South Korea, big arguments occur more than frequently when a person who's a year younger do not call the other person 형 or 누나, which means big brother and big sister in Korean. So a year later, in my sophomore year of uni, I was excited to see friends who were the same age as me entering as freshmen. And I was in a bit of a weird situation as, while I was technically unequal purely in terms of age with the freshmen, I was also at the same time a senpai. So as a friend of the same age, but also technically a senpai who has already attended 1 year of university and just knew more about the life here than them, I felt obliged to take some of the newly arrived South Korean freshmen for some food near the campus, such as in Shinokubo, which is the Koreatown of Japan that is also conveniently located only like 2 train stops away from the campus. And you know how 18-year-old kids are when they first enter Japan. They want to see that iconic red shining neon light gate located in Kabukicho, which is the gate leading into the biggest red light district of Japan. And also conveniently enough, Tokyo's Koreatown of Shinokubo and Kabukicho are literally right next to each other, with only a few minutes, or depending on where you are at the point in time, are only a few seconds walk away from each other. So after having some Korean barbecue, we walk towards the Kabukicho area from Shinokubo, and we come across this woman standing on the sidewalk, attempting to suggest something to us. And us obviously knowing the reputation that this particular area of Tokyo has, knew better than to respond back to them, so just mostly avoided eye contact and continued to walk ahead. But the thing was, back exactly 11 years ago when this happened, all of such female shootaras were foreigners. Now, does this mean that all female individuals who conduct sex work in Tokyo are foreigners? Absolutely not. But the Japanese people, at least traditionally prior to the post-pandemic, TikTok-driven Generation Z, were a very discreet group of people, including the individuals who worked in the adult industry. So as ironic as this sounds for a country that has one of the largest adult entertainment industries in the whole world, the people who compose such industries are, again, one of the most discreet and circumspect group of people in the whole world, meaning that the female Japanese individuals who were involved in such quote-unquote adult entertainment work never actually came out on the streets and physically touted themselves. The touting for such establishments were usually done by men such as these guys, who usually ask the people walking by to enter such establishments. But right now, things are changing in Japan. There has been news after news about how recently it is now young Japanese women who are standing in the area around Okubo Park in Kabukicho who are bargaining with men as they seek to provide these men with quote-unquote services at nearby love hotels in return for financial compensation. Now, I know how it sounds a bit superficial of how this practice have long been existing around the Kabukicho area for a long time, but the Japanese journalists mostly did not care back then as such women were usually older women or foreigners. And also, I know that there is bound to be a comment in the comment section of this video from a guy saying something in the lines of, it's just gonna be the same old reason, girls who are trying to pay college debt, or pay for rent, or saving up to buy expensive handbags, etc. But in fact, these people cannot be more wrong when it comes to assuming the main culprit of this concerning phenomenon of the sudden rise of such quote-unquote standing young women in Japan. So without further ado, let's dive into analyzing the main cause of this alarming phenomenon that's currently happening at the very heart of Tokyo and the important message takeaway that it has for all of us when visiting or considering any social issues regarding Japan. A 23-year-old young Japanese woman by the name of Yuka, let's just say her name is Yuka for the sake of this video, as the police did not reveal her real name, which has been rightfully done so as she is the victim, is feeling extremely lonely throughout her life in Tokyo. She did not attend university as she did not perform too well academically while in school and was originally raised in the countryside region of Japan. And to start a new life, she recently moved to Tokyo, but soon found out that things were not much different in Tokyo, or even worse when it came to curing her loneliness. And Japan being the most introverted, quote-unquote people keeping to themselves type of country in the world that it is, nobody checks upon her or asks her if she's doing okay. So while on the verge of a mental breakdown, an idea pops up in her head which is to download a dating app. She puts her profile on the dating app, and soon enough, a good-looking guy messages her and asks her if she wants to go out for some coffee. She says yes, and there they meet on the first date. On the date, she feels emotions that she has never felt in her entire life. The guy is kind and most of all, listens to what she actually has to say. For the first time in her life, she feels like a princess and thinks that someone actually cares for her. And as the date progressed, the guy asks Yuka if she could be his girlfriend, and Yuka, already infatuated with the guy at this point, says yes. But at the end of the date, the guy finally confesses to her about what he does for a living, which is that he works as a male host at a host club in Tokyo's red light district of Kabukicho. Then he asks her whether she could sometimes come by to his host club and nominate him to have a drink so that he can move up in the host popularity rankings. He promises her that things will not be expensive at all and that she just merely has to nominate him. And when she visited the host club for the first time, it did not seem as if he was lying. The price that she had to pay to nominate him was only around 1,000 Japanese yen, which is only around $10. So day after day, she visits the host club to meet her quote-unquote boyfriend Egawa, which is the actual real name of the guy that was revealed by the Japanese police. But then, day after day, the price that she had to pay in order to nominate her quote-unquote boyfriend increases substantially. According to police investigation, it came to a point where Yuka had to pay around 200,000 Japanese yen or $2,000 to nominate Egawa, in which she did almost on a nightly basis. She knew that she was getting herself into debt in which she had no way to pay back, but again, given the fact that she was completely enamored with her quote-unquote boyfriend Egawa and saw him literally as the only light of hope in her lonely life, she continued going back to the host club and nominated Egawa on a nightly basis. But as we have all expected, there soon came a point in time when Yuka very much fell behind on her due payments to the host club. And once this happened, this is when Egawa encouraged Yuka to head to the Okuba Park in Kabukicho and told her to just quote-unquote stand there. He said that if she was just to stand there, then the clients will approach her naturally. And I believe everyone here already knows why these guys quote-unquote approach these women and what kind of service they're seeking. So day after day, there was Yuka standing at the park in Kabukicho along with other young women who were also in similar predicaments, making money by providing these men with quote-unquote services at nearby love hotels, then heading back to the host club to pay back her debt. And according to the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, the vast majority of the standing young Japanese women arrested this year conducted such work for the purpose of procuring money to pay back to these host clubs. And the male host of the story, Egawa, was later arrested by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police in April 2023 for seducing, then later actively encouraging Yuka to solicit herself to quote-unquote standing up in Kabukicho and pay her earnings to him and his host club. So now, a lot of you may be quite surprised at this point, as again, many may have initially assumed that these young Japanese women are conducting such quote-unquote standing up work in order to pay college tuition debt, provide for sick families or pay rent, or for the more vain ones, make quick money to buy the Chanel bags, etc. And I'm not saying that these cases do not exist, as after research, I have found some cases where a young woman from a poor family background chose such quote-unquote standing up work in Kabukicho in order to make quick money to pay the rent that they're behind on, etc, etc. But then again, these are minority cases, as the Tokyo Metropolitan Police themselves have stated that the vast majority of the young Japanese women arrested this year in Kabukicho for such quote-unquote standing up work were all doing it for host-related cause. Now, I do not know of any single other country where such a large number of female individuals are absolutely obsessed with these, let's be honest, glorified male gigolos with what I would consider as weird hair that leech off of the earnings of the female clients. So what is the reason for this idiosyncratic Japan-only phenomenon? Based on my research of reading into myriad different responses written by various women in Japan, it mainly comes down to 3 psychological factors: loneliness, dangling with irrational hope, or just a plain and simple pursuit of hedonistic pleasure. A lot of the answers provided by the women in Japan gave the reason of loneliness and the lack of general intimacy that is the prevalent case in Japan as one of the key reasons as to why many women in Japan become obsessed with the host culture of the country. To elaborate, for many of the young women in Japan, especially the ones who originally lived and grew up in the known Tokyo regions of Japan and have recently moved to Tokyo, lack the necessary amount of friends and real relationships in general to suffice their psychological need for social interaction as well as intimacy. Hence, they may directly step into a host club in order to talk and spend time with these hosts, or as in the case of Yuka, follow an indirect path of first meeting a guy on a dating app who turns out to be a host, etc., which nonetheless ultimately leads them to the nation's host clubs that are located in Kabukicho. And of course, for the case of the older women in Japan, many women replied by saying that as many Japanese husbands begin to have a more colder, emotionless attitude to their wives once they get married, many of the married women in Japan may feel lonely and suffice their need for romantic intimacy by paying and interacting with these young hosts in Kabukicho. The second reason is the dangling of irrational hope. Now this one, I really was quite surprised when reading all of the responses from the women in Japan, and I believe their whole mental framework is just quite hard to explain. So please bear with me on this. So a lot of the male hosts in Japan are probably one of the most adept psychological manipulators of women in the entire world, with their entire livelihood depending on how well they can talk to and coax their female clients to purchase more expensive champagnes, pay higher nomination fees, which obviously becomes easier and easier relative to the degree in which the female client is infatuated with the male host. So what a lot of these Japanese male hosts do is that they dangle the idea of the boyfriend-girlfriend relationship with the female client in the lines of, if you could spend $20,000 for me this month and make me the #1 ranking host of the month, we could finally have an open relationship and be boyfriend-girlfriend. Now the reason why I say this part is hard to explain is because for most of us who have not been brainwashed by these hosts and have no emotional attachment to them, we know that all of this is just absolute lies. If we reason rationally even to the slightest degree, we know that these hosts are probably saying this to every one of their female clients to maximize their financial gain. As in, we do not have to be a rocket scientist to know this. But then, if you read the actual answers provided by the Japanese women online, so many of them still defend these hosts, making claims in the lines of, to quote, although they have the job as a host, they are still, at the end of the day, human beings. So who is to say that true love cannot develop between a male host and a female client? So in the minds of these women in Japan, they believe that we are the weird ones, blindly judging that no true love can possibly develop between a male host and a female client. So as you can see from this, these male hosts in Japan are not just some gigolos with funky hair. A lot of them, especially the really skillful ones, are very good at what they do, which is to exploit the minds of many of the young women in Japan, especially the more inexperienced, gullible ones, and make them think that true love and relationship between them can eventually manifest to reality. Of course, under the condition that the woman orders a $2,000 champagne for 10 days in a row at the host club. And as you have saw with the case of young Yuka and the male host Egawa, it is exponentially easier for the hosts to conduct such psychological manipulation to a young 20-something-year-old woman who just moved to Tokyo from the countryside, compared to, let's say, a 34-year-old woman from Tokyo who have been here and done that, and already had numerous experiences and trial and error with these type of quote-unquote bad boy men. The last main reason as to why many of the women in Japan are so immersed in the nation's host culture is actually quite simple. It's just that they enjoy talking, having drinks, and making physical contact with good-looking men. Plain and simple. Their logic goes in the lines of, a lot of men in Japan also visit hostess clubs and kabakuras, right? To talk and have drinks with these beautiful women? Same with us. We like drinking with good-looking men and spending money on them. It helps us to blow off steam. And if we have the financial means that allows us to live this lifestyle, then what's the problem? And to be frank, I believe such a mindset held by some women as their prime motives for frequenting the host clubs is probably the healthiest type of host-female client relationship that there is, compared to the loneliness dangling with the irrational hope of a potential relationship type of causes in which I have mentioned previously. Now, what can we then take away from this whole phenomenon of the rapid rise in the number of these quote-unquote standing young women in Japan? First, it shows us a glimpse of the dark side of the host culture of Japan. Thanks to the recent rise of many celebrity hosts in Japan, the host scene in Japan is now more mainstream than ever before. This means that less women perceive these hosts as these quote-unquote adult industry workers, but more in the lines of almost semi-public figures and celebrities, which in turn increases their popularity and demand, which then in turn allows many of these money-driven hosts, as in the case of the recently arrested Egawa, to carry out their schemes to psychologically manipulate many young naive women, even to the point of successfully persuading them to selling their bodies. This leads to our next point, which is our respectful urge to everyone who's watching this video to take this issue more seriously and with a sense of thoughtful maturity. For some reason, when it comes to any issues regarding Japan, many have this condescending approach to the whole thing and approach it as if it's all a joke that's happening not in a real country, composed of real people with real problems, but some type of virtual fantasy land. that Japan is just this really weird, quirky country full of anime, otakus, and a bunch of other eccentricities. And once again, everything happening inside the country is something that is just intangible and not real life. For instance, in our previous homeless teenager issue of Tokyo video that we made that almost went up to 1 million views, before we had to delete it due to us mentioning some information about a hotel chain located in Kabukicho, there were so many comments in the lines of, to quote, "Heading to Japan right now, more the reason to go to Japan." Like, here we are discussing a serious issue about domestic violence and potentially violence conducted onto minors. Then there's a bunch of people joking around saying that they're heading to Japan right now as they think this is cool and want to come check it out. So through this video, we hope that the message gets across to the people residing in the West that Japan, despite all the eccentricities in which they do have, is just as much a real country filled with real people with real problems as much as the US or any other country that you're currently residing in. Our next point is, to some degree, connected to our previous point, which is our sincere urge for all of us to have some sympathy for these quote-unquote standing young Japanese women of Kabukicho. It has become an issue in Japan as of late of how a bunch of thoughtless live streamers think that this is all just so funny, so go up to this park where these girls are standing at, stick their little live streaming cameras up in their face, and start talking to them in quite a condescending fashion. So there is currently a rising concern that many of these immature, thoughtless people who just think that this is also amusing continue to frequent this area and thus help establish the location these days as almost a quote-unquote tourist spot among the younger crowd. But come on guys, the vast majority of these young women, while mostly being able to keep their emotions in on the surface and control themselves from having a mental breakdown, at least publicly, are in such a bad place psychologically, needless to mention physically as well, literally being manipulated psychologically by many of these hosts to be doing this type of work on the street, as in the case of Yuka in our story. So the last thing we need is a bunch of live streamers sticking cameras up on their face, or a bunch of degenerates going up to them and starting a conversation with them, thinking that they're being funny and are practicing quote-unquote game in terms of talking to Japanese women, etc. Now, if you really want to help them out, you can contact non-profit organizations such as Rescue Hub ran by thoughtful individuals such as Arata Sakamoto that helps these quote-unquote standing young Japanese women of Kabukicho to escape from their predicaments and receive the support that they need. But if you are not to go to such an extent, I believe that the very least we can do when some of our audience travels to Japan in the near future and decide to visit the Kabukicho area of Tokyo and have to walk by such scenes is, rather than insensitively walking by, thinking that this is just another one of those quote-unquote unique Japanese scenes that makes the country so eccentric, at least have a degree of genuine sympathy towards them in regards to their current predicament of financial debt and psychological manipulation that they're very much likely to be suffering from in the very moment that you're looking at them.